Barry Hearn raised some eyebrows at the Dillian Whyte Oscar Rivas press conference yesterday when he talked openly about the fact that he, along with other old school promoters back in the days, used to have fighters on quote unquote slave contracts. He equated the promoter-fighter relationship in the old days to a slave-master-slave relationship. He then went on to say that times have now changed, the tables have turned, and nowadays you've got fighters like Dillian Whyte who are empowered to such a degree that they effectively now employ the promoter as a service provider. Dillian Whyte is a free agent. He's working with Matchroom on a fight-by-fight basis. He can come and go as he pleases. And essentially, fighters in this day and age are treated much better than they were in Barry Hearn's heyday. Now, some people have taken offense to Barry Hearn's use of this slavery analogy, particularly where he referred to himself as a slave master, or at least a former slave master, in the presence of two black fighters in Dillian Whyte and Oscar Rivas, who are about to fight on a show promoted by his company. A lot of people feel that's inappropriate, particularly in this extremely sensitive, politically correct climate that we live in the modern age. People have also questioned Barry Hearn's character, because if he saw himself as a slave master and the fighters as slaves back in the days, who's to say that he doesn't still see it the same way now? That is a legitimate question. But on the other side of the argument, you've got people who say, well, Barry Hearn was just being honest about the way he and his contemporaries, the other promoters around at the time when he was in his heyday and his generation, they were also exploiting fighters in the same way, but they just don't have the honesty to put their hands up and admit it. So Barry Hearn's admitting it. Furthermore, when Barry Hearn talks about being a slave master and the fighters being slaves, he's not just talking about black fighters, because of course that's where the controversy comes in. He's talking about fighters of all different races being treated as slaves by the promoters back in the days. So that's the other side of the argument that some people are putting forward. Here's my take on it. I don't know Barry Hearn. Never met the guy, never spoken to him. I cannot vouch for Barry Hearn's character. I don't know whether or not he still sees himself as a slave master and sees the fighters as slaves. But what I do know is that analogy is an accurate one, because the fighters back in the days really were treated like slaves and the promoters really were like slave masters. Now, I'll give you some examples of this. Back in the days, promoters would trade in options. So what is an option? Let's say I promote a fighter and you promote a fighter, and we're negotiating for a fight between our two boxers. And I say to you, if your guy beats my guy, I want the option to promote your fighter's next 5 fights. So I essentially own your fighter for 5 fights if he beats my fighter. And you might say, okay, cool, shake hands, deal done. The fighter was not privy to that conversation. The fighter had no say in that negotiation. The fighter couldn't say, well, I don't want to be promoted by that promoter for my next 5 fights. I don't like him. I don't want to be in his pocket and controlled by him and told who I'm going to fight, where I'm going to fight for the next 5 fights, 2 years, whatever the case may be. I don't want that. Back in the days, the fighters were not given the option to refuse in situations like that. His promoter and the rival promoter did the deal without the fighter's knowledge, or at least the fighter's consent. That was commonplace back in the days. Today, of course, you do have promoters who want options on fighters. Sometimes promoters still do get options on fighters, but it's not as common as it used to be. And the options are not usually as extensive as they used to be. Generally today, options rarely extend beyond, the standard immediate rematch clause, like you get in championship fights. But occasionally you will get a promoter who has the options of promoting, one or two, or maybe two, let's say 2 or 3 of a fighter's subsequent fights should that fighter beat one of theirs. But like I say, in most instances, fighters are privy to this particular aspect in the negotiation process, and they get the right to say, okay, I'm not taking that deal. I mean, recently we had Bob Arum saying that Deontay Wilder, in order for him to get the Tyson Fury fight, he needs to sign a promotional agreement with Top Rank and ESPN for 5 fights or whatever it was. Well, Deontay Wilder got the opportunity to turn that down. Back in the days, he might not have had that opportunity. His promoter might have said to Bob Arum, okay, we'll do it. And Deontay Wilder may not have had a say. Today, he does have a say. Okay, so that's one way in which fighters were exploited back in the days, kept in the dark about things that happened in negotiations. But in the modern age, it's not like that so much. It still goes on here and there, but it's not as prevalent as it used to be. Another, and just to give you an example, by the way, of a promoter having options on somebody, Evander Holyfield, for his early career through his first 2 reigns as heavyweight champion, was promoted by Main Events. But when he signed up to fight Mike Tyson for the first time, Don King had options on Evander Holyfield. So you go look at, any of these Holyfield fights, let's say his fight against Riddick Bowe. You see the promoter there, Rock Newman, that was Bowe's promoter. Main Events, Kathy Duva. And you can go through the list of all the Evander Holyfield fights, and you're going to find Main Events, Kathy Duva, etc. In collaboration with whichever other promoter was promoting the other guy. But when he fought Tyson, that was a Don King promotion, and Don King admitted openly, because then it was standard practice, that he had options on Holyfield. So all of a sudden, Holyfield goes from being promoted by Main Events to being promoted by Don King for literally years. Now, I don't know whether Holyfield in this particular instance had any choice in the matter. I suspect that he didn't, because back then it was commonplace for fighters to have no choice. So there he was promoted by Don King for the Tyson rematch. He was promoted by Don King for the Michael Moorer fight. He was promoted by Don King for the Vaughn Bean fight. He was promoted by Don King for the Lennox Lewis fight. He was promoted by Don King for the Lennox Lewis rematch. He was promoted by Don King for all 3 John Ruiz fights. He was promoted by Don King for the Hasim Rahman fight. He was promoted by Don King for the Chris Bird fight. I mean, on and on it goes. This is a guy who wasn't a Don King fighter. This is a guy who was a Main Events fighter. Now, I don't know how many of those fights where he was promoted by Don King were as a result of the options that King had on him from the Mike Tyson first fight. But I know that King had a contract that allowed him to promote multiple Evander Holyfield fights if he beat Mike Tyson. Okay, this was standard practice back in the days. Furthermore, another way in which fighters were exploited was the fact that fighters didn't get pay slips back in the days. I remember Oscar De La Hoya talking about how Golden Boy were the first major promoters in the US to start giving fighters pay slips, because prior to that, the fighters had no idea how much money the show was making. No idea how much profit the show was making, and therefore whether they were getting a fair cut of that profit. The fighters were deliberately kept in the dark. Yeah, fighters were very often shortchanged by promoters. Fighters were very often paid late or not paid at all. This is how badly they were exploited. And again, these kind of things still go on today, but it's nowhere near as severe or prevalent as it used to be back then. And again, you had fighters of all different ethnicities, and I'm sure there were promoters who treated certain ethnicities of fighters even worse. But the mistreatment of fighters was universal right the way across the color spectrum. Yeah, it was happening to everybody. I mean, you had fighters back in the days who physically attacked promoters because they felt as though they'd been mistreated so badly. Mike Tyson physically attacked Don King. In fact, I think several fighters physically attacked Don King because they felt as though he'd mistreated them. Then you had the case of Terry Marsh. Terry Marsh was a former fighter of Frank Warren's. Frank Warren ended up being shot and nearly killed, and Terry Marsh was subsequently arrested and put on trial, charged with shooting Frank Warren because Marsh and Warren were involved in a liable dispute. And so, for whatever reason, the police at the time and the Crown Prosecution Service felt that there was enough evidence to suggest that Terry Marsh, who we know was a former fighter of Frank Warren, who we know was in a legal dispute with Warren, they felt there was enough evidence to actually charge him with shooting Warren. He was subsequently acquitted of shooting Frank Warren, but Frank Warren, even though he admits that he knows who shot him, and you can see that here in this interview here, Frank Warren knows who shot him, but he refuses to cooperate with the police and tell them because, in his own words, he doesn't want to be labeled a grass or a snitch, a rat, etc. Because that's how it was for him in the area he grew up, and he still lives by those principles, according to him. Would Terry Marsh have gone to prison for attempted murder if Frank Warren had come out and told the police who shot him? I don't know. I'm not accusing Terry Marsh of anything, and I'm certainly not accusing Frank Warren of mistreating Terry Marsh. The point I'm making is it was quite common to see fighters physically attack promoters back in the days. This is a case where that might have happened, right? I don't know whether Terry Marsh was actually the guy who tried to kill Frank Warren or not. Many people believe he was. Many people believe he wasn't. So I'll leave that up for you guys to debate. But the point I'm making is fighters of all races were accusing promoters of mistreatment back in those days. And in some cases, they were, in many cases, they were legitimately being mistreated. Okay. Now, again, getting back to Barry Hearn's character and whether he still sees himself as a slave master, I've got no idea. What I do know is the likes of Dillian Whyte are not on slave contracts. Ever since Eddie Hearn took over the boxing arm of Matchroom Sport, Barry Hearn's company, I don't think they've actually caught any legal cases from fighters. I can't remember any fighters coming out accusing Eddie Hearn of exploiting them financially, ripping them off, or anything like that. So, times have changed. People like Dillian Whyte really are in a better position than they would have been in the 1990s and earlier. So, whether Barry Hearn still has that messed up attitude now or not, it's kind of irrelevant, because as long as the fighters are not being put on slave contracts anymore and not being treated like that, then what Barry Hearn thinks in his head stays in his head. All right? If Barry Hearn had come out and specifically referred to black fighters as slaves, I would be offended. If Barry Hearn came out and specifically referred to Oscar Rivas and Dillian Whyte as slaves, I would be offended. But from what I can see, and remember, this is not the first time that Barry Hearn has made this analogy. In several interviews, and I've talked about this in previous videos, some of you guys may remember, that Barry Hearn has referred to the relationship between promoters and fighters back in the days as a slave master slave relationship. He's done this in several interviews in the past, several years ago. And in those interviews, it was just him and the interviewer in the room. Okay, so as far as I can tell, he was just referring to fighters in general, in which case, fair enough. Yeah, if you're just being honest and saying that you were involved in exploiting fighters, it is what it is. That certainly doesn't make you look good. Right? It certainly brings your character into question, but at least you're honest about it, I guess. And at the end of the day, the way Matchroom run their business right now, again, I've never heard any of their fighters come out and say that they were on a slave contract with Eddie Hearn. I've never heard any of these fighters come out and issue legal proceedings against Eddie Hearn and get caught up in some court case. I haven't seen any of that so far. The proof is in the pudding at the end of the day. So that's what I'll say about the whole situation. Again, not surprising that Barry Hearn has come in for this criticism, and Eddie Hearn's going to have to deal with it too, because particularly in the United States, people are going to jump on this. So he's going to have to, do some explaining on behalf of his dad. Tyson Fury has already come out and defended himself, because Barry Hearn did take some shots at Tyson Fury at the press conference, no doubt about it. But then again, Tyson Fury's taken shots at him many times, so all's fair in love and war. But Tyson Fury has also referenced this slave trader comment, and he's kind of told Eddie Hearn to put his dad back in the cupboard, which I thought was pretty funny. So anyway, let me know what you guys think about the situation in the comment section below. It's happening, I'm out.
Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.